5 and it is Thursday, so we've got our next chapter of Tom's Midnight Garden, and we are actually up to chapter 15, The View from the Wall. In following the course of Tom's historical researches and his reasoning, we have gone a little ahead upon the order of events, as Tom perceived them, in the garden. The treehouse in which he and Hattie quarrelled was not built immediately after the episodes of the geese upon the lawn and the little girl in mourning. Indeed, on the very next visit to the garden after those happenings, Tom thought for a time that he had lost Hattie for good. The garden appeared absolutely deserted. He called and searched through all the hidden hiding places. He dashed round and round the trunk of the fir tree, imagining he heard her slippers moving nimbly on the dry earth of the other side, always evading him. But if Hattie had hidden, she had hidden better than ever before, and made the garden seem a green emptiness. He saw over the south wall a thread of smoke that mounted vertically onto the soft, still summer air, and it occurred to him that Abel was perhaps tending to his bonfire. He stopped dead by the orchard door, wondering whether he should thrust himself through it again. If Abel were the other side, he might provide some clue as to Hattie's whereabouts. Suddenly, the orchard door opened and Hattie came through. At once, all Tom's anxiety turned to annoyance, especially as Hattie looked far from anxious, excited, rather even pleased. Her face was flushed and there was a bonfire smut on one cheek. She held something in her pinafore pocket. "Why didn't you answer?" Tom demanded. "Didn't you hear me? I called and I called and I called." "I was helping Abel with his bonfire." "You could have come and opened the orchard door and let me through. I like bonfires too, you know." "You wouldn't have liked this bonfire. You wouldn't have liked what we were burning on it." She looked at him defiantly. "Well, what were you burning on it?" Now she lost courage and cast her eyes down, but finally said, "The bow and arrows." "Oh, Tom, it was Abel who wanted to have them burnt." Tom was silent, guessing why Abel had wished it. He had always said that the bow might bring trouble to Hattie, and indeed it had. Hattie went on. "And as well as that, he wanted me to promise not to borrow any more knives from the kitchen, because they're so sharp and might cut and hurt me. And if I promised to him that I would burn the bow and arrows, and if I promised not to use the kitchen knives again, he said he'd give me a little knife all of my own." "What kind of knife?" She brought her hand out of her pinafore pocket and opened it. Across the palm lay a gaudy, cheap little penknife, ornamented with true love knots in blue. "He bought it at the fair to give to Susan, but she wouldn't have it from him because it's unlucky to have a knife from your sweetheart, so Abel gave it to me. It's a dear little knife." She turned it over lovingly. "Open it," ordered Tom. Hattie did so and held it towards him so that he could look at the blade. There was only one. "Well," Tom laughed shortly, "you certainly couldn't cut yourself with that. You could cut about butter with it, that's all." Hattie was still admiring the coloured decoration on the haft, and she said, "I've cut more than butter with it already. Come and I'll show you." There was a touch of mystery and pride in which she took Tom to one of the yew trees. It was the one called Matterhorn, and showed him the tree trunk, on which were carved, or rather scratched, half pressed, the initials H.M. Tom was wondering what surname the M stood for, but not liking to ask when Hattie said, "That means Hattie Melbourne has claimed and climbed this tree. With my knife, I carved my initials on all the yew trees, except for Trixie, of course." "It's very wrong to carve things on trees," said Tom, remembering suddenly to be severe. "It's like leaving litter about." Hattie opened her eyes wide, as though she had never heard of litter, and Tom could tell by her expression that she didn't think her carvings could be wrong, on her trees anyway. She intended to go on doing it if she liked, and without telling him. "And," Tom pointed out, "you'll only get yourself into trouble if anyone sees those tree trunks. They'll see H.M. and they'll know your initials and they'll know you're to blame. Now, if I wanted to carve my mark on a tree, which of course I wouldn't ever, but if I wanted to, I'd make a secret mark. He told her of his device of the long Tom cat for Tom Long. I can't say his name. Tom Long. Hattie was envious. No one's such a stupid name. There's Hattie, said Tom. You could draw a hat. Hattie's eyes sparkled. Only of course you mustn't. I've told you why not. And now, he said, suddenly tiring of talking, let's do something. Agreed, Hattie said. So at once their play began again in the garden and went on as though the garden and their games never ever needed to end. They went tree climbing again. It was a passion with them. As Hattie had mentioned not being able to climb Trixie, Tom taught her how to swarm. She did not learn easily, chiefly from a horror of dirtying her clothes so much that her aunt might notice and punish her. But after a while she learned how to wind her arms and legs about the trunk and worm her way upwards. In the end, she climbed Trixie, and she was triumphant. They played new games. Hattie found grasses of wild barley growing in the wilderness and picked them. She showed Tom how to nip the top out the grass head and then replace it, and then, holding the grass in one fist, she would knock against it with the other, repeating, "Grandmother, grandmother, jump out of bed!" On the word jump, she would give a particularly hard knock, and the top of the grass would spring out of its green bed into the air, and Hattie would laugh. Tom would too. Together they hunted for young frogs under the leaves of the strawberry bed. Abel said they stuck the strawberries and set them hopping elsewhere. Once they had the sight of a toad in a crevice under the threshold stone of the greenhouse, like a stone himself, brown and dull and unmoving, except for the breadth of its sides. They teased the birds of the garden. Tom was particularly good at surprising them, at hoaxing the watchful jay, yet they protected them against all comers, too. Hattie let out birds from the gooseberry wire and from under the strawberry nets, and when she was sure Abel was far away, she unlatched the door of the sparrow trap. When any of the cousins came into the garden with a gun, Tom ran ahead, waving his arms and shouting to warn the birds. Wild pigeons rose heavily from the rows of peas where they had been browsing and made their way back to the safety of the wood. Nothing was ever shot, unless you could count Tom himself, who once received a spatter of pellets through the middle. Hattie went pale, but Tom just laughed. All they'd done is tickle him. One day, when Tom and Hattie had been gazing at the sundial on the south wall, trying to make out how it told the time, they saw a wren light on one of the stone sunbeams above the dial, and then the beams projected a little way away from the wall, disappearing behind them. "Do you think there's a wren's nest there?" whispered Hattie, and Tom thought there might well be, but of course one couldn't be sure from the path below. "James once walked to the top of the sundial," said Hattie. "Well, I'm not going to," said Tom. "It would just be silly, not brave. That was far too high. It would be very narrow at the top too. It would just be far too dangerous." "Oh, Tom, I didn't mean that she'd walk it," said Hattie in dismay. "James only did it for a dare. Cousin Edgar dared him, and James did it. He walked the whole length, and then he climbed down, and then he fought Cousin Edgar, and then he was sick. And Cousin Hubert heard about it all afterwards. He was very angry, because he said James might have fallen and broken his neck." Tom was silent, turning over in his mind what Hattie had just said. He was beginning to change his mind about climbing the wall, because he saw that there could not be, for him, the danger that there had been for James. He might possibly fall off the wall, but a fall, even from such a height, could neither bruise nor break him. He sat and said to Hattie, "I'm going to see if there really is a nest behind the sundial. I'm going to walk along that wall." "Oh, Tom!" The way in which Hattie said, "Oh, Tom," made Tom feel warm and kind. He patted her hand. "Don't worry, it's all right for me." He climbed, by means of the laddering branches of an espalier pear, to the top of the wall. In spite of all he had told himself, he felt a pang of horror when he stood upright upon it. The wall top was so narrow, 9 inches in some places, weathered away to even less by crumbling brickwork. Quite bushy plants grew along it over the top, which Tom would have to step. And on either side of the narrow, hazardous path, the wall face was sheer and far, down to the orchard on the other side, and on the other, down to the garden where Hattie stood, her face pale, upturned to him. Tom knew, however, that he must not look down. If he were to keep his head and walk that wall top, he lifted his eyes and stepped resolutely forward. Very soon, he was over the porchway into the orchard, and then over the vine against the wall, and then over the sundial. He could see the dead leaves and the other airy garden rubbish that had drifted into the space between the stone sunbeams and the wall. At one end, they seemed much denser than elsewhere. Tom got closer upon his hands and knees on top of the wall, and, peering closely, saw that this was indeed a wren's nest, with moss still greeny brown worked into it. He could see the little hole of entry. "There's a wren's nest," he called softly to Hattie, "but I daren't touch it. I daren't for her sake." Come back down now, Tom." He stood upright again, intending to turn back as Hattie had said, but now, standing there, gazing freely upon him, he was taken by a sudden joy. He began to pace along the wall like a king. Hattie was keeping step with him below and whispering up to him, but he paid no attention. He was far too high above her and the garden altogether. He had thought himself high when he had climbed to the top of the yew trees, but he was higher now still. In one sweep of the eye, he could see the whole layout of the garden and the boundaries of the walls and hedges that enclosed it. He could see the house. There was Susan leaning from an upper window to blow a kiss to somebody in the garden. Abel, he supposed. He could see into the courtyard of the house, a courtyard whose existence he had never suspected before. He saw Edgar there, engaged in washing Pincher in a tin bath of soapy water. Pincher looked very clean and wretched, with his neck poked forward and his ears folded back and his tail down. Tom, in exhilaration, called to him, "Cheer up, Pincher!" Pincher heard him, or saw him, or maybe even smelt him. It was difficult to tell which. Even under the lather, his hackles rose, and he suddenly bolted from the bath and had to be chased round the yard and caught by Edgar, who was very much annoyed and covered with splashes and soap buds and water. Tom saw beyond the garden and the house to a lane, down which a horse and cart were plodding. Beyond the lane was a meadow, and then a meandering line that he knew must be the river. The river flowed past the meadow and reached the village, and past that. It reached a white handrail bridge and slipped under it, and then away, towards what pools and watermills and locks and ferries that Hattie and Tom knew nothing of. So the river slipped away into the distance, in the direction of Castleford and Ely and King's Lynn, to the grandeur of the sea. "What do you see beyond the garden, Tom?" Hattie whispered up to him, her curiosity having overcome her fears. "If you were up here yourself to see," Tom said, and his words floated high over the whole garden. He could not tell her, could not hope to convey to her without her seeing it in the distance. In a flat countryside, as this was, even a slight eminence giving a commanding view, as from a mountain peak. Tom, before, had known only the garden, and a very little beyond its limits. Now, from this wall top, he saw what seemed to be a whole world. "Tell me what you see," Hattie pleaded. "Well, from the top of the wall, you can see the river," Tom began. "And if you follow the river with your eye—" "Yes, yes," whispered Hattie. Tom did not finish what he said, for at that moment Abel came round the corner of the trees. He was running. He rushed straight at Hattie, his hands set upon her shoulders and pressed down, so that Tom saw her suddenly crumple to the ground in a kneeling position. Then he thrust something into her hand and, standing over her, began speaking in a lowered, quick voice. Tom heard Hattie's voice replying. She sounded frightened. He could not hear what either of them said. In haste, Tom retraced his steps along the wall and climbed down again into the garden. By that time, Hattie was alone. "What on earth was the matter?" Tom asked. "Abel thought I was going to walk along the top of the wall, as James did," said Hattie. "He wanted to stop me because of the danger." "I thought he was going to beat you." "He made me kneel down on the path and swear on the Bible. Swear never to climb the sundial wall and never to walk along it." "Was he very angry?" asked Tom. Hattie said slowly, "No. I think, somehow, he was just frightened." "Frightened?" Tom frowned. "You mean that you were frightened? He was angry?" "No. I was frightened a little, just because he was so quick and strong, but I'm sure he was frightened too, and much more frightened. When he made me take the Bible, his hand was all clammy and it shook. Why did he suddenly think you might try and climb the wall? Asked Tom. Because he saw me looking up at it in that way, I suppose. No, that couldn't be the reason, said Tom. He was running when he came round that corner of the trees. He must have been running with the Bible in his hand before he ever came within sight of you. Perhaps he heard me talking to you at the top of the wall. No, you only whispered. He couldn't have heard me. By that, Tom did not mean that he had spoken very quietly, for he had not. He meant that. Even if he had shouted with all his strength, his voice could never have been heard by Abel. Well then, said Hattie, perhaps Susan saw me from a bedroom window and came down and told him. Perhaps, said Tom. I saw Susan at a window, but he was not satisfied with that explanation she gave. At about this time, Hattie and Tom started on the building of the treehouse, and they soon forgot about Abel's strange behaviour and the absorption of their new work. And that is the end of chapter 15. I hope you're enjoying listening to these. We are missing you very much. Bye, Year 5.